Now that we made it through your character's zone and role, it's time to talk about the third aspect of a playstyle, dynamic. Your dynamic describes the ways in which your character will interact with the shared fictional world of a tabletop role-playing game outside of combat. This is usually called the interaction and exploration pillars of play in D&D. Your dynamic doesn't dictate how you're supposed to roleplay your character. Rather, it's a summary of how certain skills and features aid characters in achieving certain non-combative goals in the game. Your dynamic should be a guide for how you improvise your character's interactions, and these dynamics can blend together to make characters with even more roleplay depth. A tinkering artificer might serve as the party's dungeoneer and supplier, a pretty boy fighter might be the face and the muscle, and the party navigator could also be the group's heart, guiding them through the wilderness and treating their wounds after a rough battle. In this video, we're going to go through each of these dynamics and detail some examples from fiction, as well as what classes give you these proficiencies or features that contribute to that playstyle aspect. Then at the end of each dynamic, I'm also going to be giving my recommended class for it, as well as an option that surprised me for how well it does that dynamic. Backgrounds can also contribute to your dynamic, but I won't be getting into them here because of the codified build a background rules. I've also got to touch on expertise in jack of all trades because these features would just make Bard and Rogue absolutely dominate every single dynamic if I didn't put some kind of a restriction on there. So I'm only going to be considering these features if the class gains proficiency with skills relating to the playstyle, and the class's primary combat ability synergizes with those skills. Also, be encouraged to develop dynamics other than what I listed here. These are going to be more traditional, but if you can come up with more, leave them in the comments. I'm just a fantasy and TTRPG enthusiast at the end of the day, and the last thing I want to do is make you feel boxed in by an explanation. So think of my analytical style the same way Aristotle wrote his metaphysics. I try to define ideas to better understand and explain them, not to reduce the beauty or the essence of the idea. These are just fun topics to discuss, so let's get into dynamics with the brain. The brain, or the mind as I've also seen it called, is the group researcher into the properties of things. These are the characters searching through occult tomes, history books, and religious texts for any hint of lore. In D&D, these all tend to fall under the same scope as far as a brain dynamic goes, but in pop culture we typically see two types of brains presented, what I'll call here the Arcanist and the Scribe. Both present comparable levels of intellectual prowess, but focus on different fields. Probably my favorite example of this contrast is the relationship between Dr. Orpheus and Dr. Venture of the Venture Brothers, and I'm gonna reference this show again later because holy shit is this show amazing at fleshing out a character's persona.
You dick! Dr. Orpheus did this!
Dr. Orpheus is the resident necromancer and Dr. Strange cosplayer at the Venture compound, and Venture is a scientist long past his prime. Instead of putting Dr. Venture in the overdone science versus religion scenario, Orpheus acts as Venture's lancer in a friendly rivalry of science versus magic.
I could incinerate this entire lab! Make you believe that you are a very special episode of Blossom! And shoot lightning from my hands!
Ooh, laser ray, mind control helmet, Tesla coil. Anything else?
This is the kind of banter I would have loved out of an artificer and wizard pair at a D&D table, and why I'm pretty behind a scholar, inventor, or engineer class. Getting back to this dynamic, whatever the flavor, this is the character doing a majority of the intelligence checks, holding up in the library, doing any necessary transcribing of ancient books, and sure to be played by Benedict Cumberbatch in the movie adaptation of your story. The brain is going to prioritize intelligence and then very likely wisdom, and you're going to want proficiency with nature, arcana, history, investigation, medicine, religion, some configuration of those skills, and then language proficiencies to either transcribe or translate any kinds of conversations. But I think for my recommended class, I'm going to go for Artificer. And this feels a little bit unfair because the Artificer's base class came late into 5th edition, and the general power budget of this class is much higher than most of the other base classes. Wizard has no problem being the party brain, and likely would have been my choice for the ideal class to build a brain had it not been for Artificer's flash of genius. The one that surprised me here was Warlock. Had Warlock been the intelligence caster so many believe it should be, this would have been a clean sweep. You can pick up Eldritch Invocations to aid just about every dynamic, but Warlock gets access to possibly the strongest roleplay feature for this dynamic, Eyes of the Runekeeper. This feature basically has no uses in combat, but being able to instantly translate any writing has so much potential for defining your character. If you want to consider this a ribbon, it's my vote for probably the strongest ribbon feature currently in the game. The Dungeoneer is a dynamic focused on overcoming the common challenges of dungeons. Seeing as dungeons makes up half the name of this game, the Dungeoneer is a valuable dynamic to have in any party. This dynamic is a little bit more mechanically focused, and you can think of it as the MacGyver of D&D. If you've seen Indiana Jones, played The Legend of Zelda, Tomb Raider, watched R2-D2 in Star Wars, you know what the Dungeoneer is all about. Dungeoneers need to come equipped with the abilities that help detect traps and the tools to disarm them. A scythe trap doesn't care about your nat 20 persuasion check, it's going to swing no matter how correct you are. For this, the Dungeoneer favors perception and investigation skills, as well as proficiency with thieves' tools for disarming. I personally allow Tinker's tools to do this as well, but that isn't exactly codified anywhere. It also helps that Dexterity is a class's strong saving throw proficiency, as it tends to be the most common saving throw made against triggered traps. Bonus points if you can get proficiency with Arcana checks or the Dispel magic spell, as both of these can add a lot to this dynamic interacting with magical traps. If at some point you can get proficiency with Constitution saving throws, you won't have to fear those traps that try to poison you instead of stab you. Of course, through looking at the different profiles, it's kind of a no-duh that Rogue is going to be built for Dungeoneering. Part of why the Thief might be a little bit underwhelming as the archetypal Dungeoneer of this edition is the fact that so much of the subclass's dynamic seems to be spread out across the base class. I hear people say that Rogue's only job is to sneak attack, but the party rogue has the features needed to make sure that you even get to the big bad evil guy before setting off every dart trap and pressure plate in the dungeon. Wizards of the Coast did everything they could to reinforce this dynamic on the rogue, aside from giving it a 10-foot pole as part of its standard starting equipment. I say my surprise star here, but it really shouldn't have been a surprise at all because the tools expert is always going to make for a fantastic trap breaker. Artificers exist as an interesting rogue-wizard hybrid, with access to a spell list that includes Mage Hand, Identify, and Dispel Magic. Essentially, the rogue is the dexterous Dungeoneer and the artificer is the intellectual. Both classes have a great level progression for this dynamic, they just do so in different ways. Due to the memes, the face is likely the most well-known dynamic of them all, and its real strength is in helping to progress the story through social interaction. There are some fights you just can't win through brute force, but you just might be able to talk your way out of it. The face can be a scoundrel that focuses on subterfuge, a diplomat of renowned honor, and yes, even the horn dog that seems to think that seduction is an actual skill check. If you want to play a face, it should be absolutely required that you watch The Road to El Dorado. This movie is basically the D&D adventure of a rogue and a bard competing for the spot of the party face.
You fight like my sister. I fought your sister. That's a compliment. Blackguard!
What makes a good face isn't just the ability to talk oneself into or out of a situation. It's also in detecting deceit. Insight checks are extremely valuable to the face, as well as the ability to figure out if the other party is being forthright in their identity. The face can also find some love and wisdom saves, seeing as those are the most common saves made against the charm condition, the most common condition to come up when it comes to social interaction. Keep in mind, DMs, shapeshifters tend to be fairly social creatures, and your party face will never forget such an encounter. This one's going to be pretty straightforward. Primary ability, Charisma. Absolutely Charisma. Secondary, it's going to be nice to get Wisdom for those insight checks. Proficiencies, basically any Charisma check that you can pick up is going to be very nice, as well as Insight. If you want to go with the Subterfuge route, you can pick up Disguise Kits for a really cool kind of spy feel to your face. And then lastly, languages to help you parlay and just interact socially. Alright, you all know that this one's already coming, but let's talk about why the Bard is my recommended class for a face. Bard has a separate version of expertise from the Rogue, wherein it only applies to skill checks instead of skill and tools checks. This in combination with Jack of all trades means that most players are usually going to double down on their proficiency in the skills that they can already see their character doing really well with, making Bard's charisma-based spellcasting and social synergy look extremely appealing. Counter Charm is there despite its flaws, which helps to compensate for Bard's lack of wisdom saving throw proficiency, but you can gain this later on through a feat. And then another surprise star in Warlock. While Rogue is a skill monkey, nothing other than skill checks synergizes with the charisma investment unless you go Swashbuckler. Warlock gets possibly the most out-of-combat friendly form of spellcasting thanks to the short rest refresh of Pact Magic, using Charisma as its spellcasting ability. Add to that, several of the Eldritch invocations allow for things like at-will disguise self with mask of many faces, the ability to read all writing with Eyes of the Runekeeper, and hell, even the Great Old One, despite its many flaws, gains telepathic speech to any creature within 30 feet of it. Warlock brings a dark flair to the face dynamic, really only left wanting for a form of expertise in these social skills. Hearts are the glue that keeps the party together. They can come in many forms: divine healers, potion brewing apothecaries, remarkable cooks, field surgeons, and even necromancers can fit this dynamic. This dynamic is one of the caretaker, and its role extends beyond healing to bolstering, buffing, and sustaining the party as well. There's several options for making a heart in 5th edition that aren't strictly tied down to divine classes. The new chef feat in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything makes you the food truck of the Forgotten Realms. The healer feat allows you to do some quick patch-up work on your allies after combat, and by using herbalism kits, you can create potions of healing given the downtime. Roleplay-wise, hearts tend to be the voice of reason in a party. Jake the dog acts as the heart in Adventure Time, not just because the guy can cook, but he also nurtures Finn as a big brother. Jake keeps his relatively calm demeanor in the face of Finn's childlike antics, meaning while Finn has the habit of putting himself in harm's way, Jake's misfortune is mostly due to miscalculations or the fault of others.
You always know what to say.
Blah blee blue blah blah blue blee blah blue blue.
Okay, I'm convinced. Let's roll!
Sweet. Things are gonna start going our way. Hey, look. See? What'd I tell you?
While personality and behavior is flexible, one thing doesn't change. The heart is always looking out for others. Seeing as there are feats that can evoke this dynamic, we're going to look specifically at the provided proficiencies and class features that can help get a heart across. Access to healing magic is a big plus, but class features that can do so separately from spell slots will be weighted heavier here. Also, from talks I've had with other D&D personalities, DMs, and designers, it sounds like just about everyone house rules a character with alchemist supplies proficiency the ability to create potions of healing, so I'll consider that here as a possible alternative to herbalism kits. Your primary ability is pretty flexible here, but I want to say that the heart's main trait is most likely going to be wisdom, as that's what's going to synergize with a lot of your skill checks. For your proficiencies, medicine is a must. I'd say followed by nature to make sure that nobody picks up and eats any poisonous plants, survival to help you with foraging, and then the tool proficiency that describes the way in which you help out others. For my recommended class on this one, it's going to go to Druid. I would have pictured Cleric in here, but Druid also absolutely makes sense. A spellcasting ability that synergizes with medicine and survival checks, given first level proficiency with herbalism kits, and all the healing magic you want from the Cleric, if you're playing post Tasha's that is, this is the ideal class for playing out a heart. If I was to pinpoint a specific subclass for this, I would most likely say Shepherd, but I feel like Dreams should be the one for this dynamic, but it's just a little undertuned in comparison. If you were to simply give Dreams some circle spells, I think it would go a long way and possibly make it the main heart for 5e. Other close contenders here are Bard and Alchemist Artificer, likely because Cleric just doesn't get much in the way of these heart proficiencies that I've listed. However, Cleric is most likely going to be higher up in this dynamic based on their spellcasting mechanics alone. And the surprise star here is going to go to Monk Way of Mercy. Since this one's relatively new, I hadn't done a whole lot of research into it until I started making this script. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything was pretty kind to Monk, and the Way of Mercy is a terrifyingly good healer. They can use Key to restore hit points equal to a roll of their martial arts die, plus their wisdom modifier, meaning that at 11th level, you're getting 11 uses of a first level Cure Wounds spell every short rest, and it works with Flurry of Blows. While Bard, Paladin, and Cleric are all amazing hearts, it was the Way of Mercy Monk specifically that just absolutely took me by surprise. Thought Strength was a dumb stat? Well, you're not entirely wrong, but it's not without its uses. While a Dungeoneer or Sneak wants to break into something, the Muscle wants to break down something. There's nothing wrong with being the strong man of the group. Every party needs its resonant battering ram because it doesn't matter how good your Thieves' Tools checks are when it's a boulder blocking your passage instead of a door. The Muscle is favored as the intimidator of the group, but you don't always have to be a bully. In fact, it's more fun to figure out ways to get use out of athletics and intimidation checks without pure force. Just watch this clip of probably the best Muscle in fiction ever, Brock Samson, pulling a full alpha intimidation check after slaughtering a stowaway alligator.
You can't enter the United Nations with that weapon.
It's all right, soldier. Mr. Sampson is my bodyguard.
Just the same, Doctor. No weapons allowed. I'll have to confiscate it.
Go ahead. Take it from me.
See, Brock didn't bully that guard, he stood his ground. That can be more than enough to intimidate your enemies. Also, don't be under the impression that muscle has to be dumb. Big dumb guys and gals can be comedic relief at the table, but it's a bit of a tired trope. Imagine if Ashley Johnson had played Yasha as a female mirror to Travis Williams' Grog. I think fans would have grown tired of the new character within the first 10 episodes. Instead, Ashley plays her as a somewhat socially awkward mother figure to the group, and made her muscle dynamic something wholly different from the Goliath barbarian of the first campaign. It's still hilarious to watch Travis's reaction anytime Yasha goes into rage.
So I would like to rage. Would like to rage. Yeah. Yes. And I would like to rage. Yeah. So I would like to rage. Yeah. I would like to rage.
Yeah. Muscle respects muscle. Muscle traits: primary, strength; secondary, charisma. Not super important if your table allows the variant strength used for intimidation checks rule that I see a lot of people using. Proficiencies, super straightforward: athletics, intimidation. Now, of course, variant strength rule, absolutely go for barbarian. I think it's going to be super in flavor. But if we're just going with the codified rules, the recommended class for this is actually going to be paladin. The sad story for the barbarian is it just doesn't provide everything you'd want out of this archetype, and the muscle needs to have some charisma investment as per the vanilla rules. Paladin's heavy armor proficiency means that they're not incredibly worried about divesting away from constitution or dexterity for charisma, and it helps out with their spellcasting. Other than the proficiencies in primaries, Paladin doesn't get much outside of spellcasting to help in this role, but if you were to go like Conquest Paladin, I'm sure you're gonna feel pretty at home playing the muscle. And if I can just talk back about Barbarian for a second, Rage would be a feature that could absolutely push Barbarian over the top for this, but it's super restricted by its uses. How often are you really going to use Rage outside of combat? Maybe for pretty intense, flavorful roleplay moments, but it's nearly always going to lead towards combat if you do, because you'll lose that Rage extremely quickly. If there had been an additional condition for Rage to extend if you make a strength check during your turn, I think Barb would have been sitting real pretty here. DMs, if you have a player that's very intent on playing a muscle, I would really consider allowing the variant rule for strength to be used in place of charisma for intimidation checks, relating specifically to that character's physical prowess. The tied-in abilities and skill checks of D&D 5e need this kind of flexibility, and it's gonna make your party muscle feel way more useful outside of combat. My surprise star is Bard, and I guess this is a thing? I mean, after all, intimidation is a charisma check, so it looks like Muscle Bard going Valor or Swords could work. Jack of all trades lets you focus on strength a little bit more, but the build goes against so much of what Bard really tries to do. However, you could multi-class Bard Varian, and now we're talking. Rage for the situational athletics checks, spells that you can cast that don't require concentration, magical secrets allowing you to grab Armor of Agathis and Shield. This actually makes me really want to roll up a Scald Barbarian so bad. In survival-heavy campaigns, this dynamic is absolutely essential. The Navigator is going to be the character keeping the party from getting lost in the wild, the one foraging for food, and keeping their eyes out for trouble. These last three dynamics all have a focus around the surprise mechanic as well. Navigators prevent surprise, Scouts coordinate surprise, Sneaks confirm surprise. In order to prevent surprise, you're going to want a high passive perception, requiring perception proficiency and investment into wisdom. Perception also applies to a ton of situations, so you're going to get a lot of use out of it even when you aren't out on the road. Survival is going to be your second priority, because this is how you tell where you're going, if the weather's changing, the time of day, foraging for food, everything. After that, it's pretty much your call, but nature's great for identifying poisonous flora and fungi. Animal handling is a nice snag for peacefully dealing with random beasts that you might encounter, because stumbling into a sleuth of bears is bad news for even higher level parties. For tools, cartographer's tools and vehicles are a no-brainer for this dynamic if you can get them. It's rare that a class gives these proficiencies, so check out some of the backgrounds whenever you're building your navigator. My top choice for this is going to be the Ranger, and hear me out on this. Natural Explorer is actually the strongest navigation feature in the game. It has its issues and lack of use in many scenarios, but you can't deny that whenever they do come into play, that they're remarkable for you as a navigator. The times I see this feature really dogged are in long-running massive scale campaigns that take place over multiple terrain types. It starts to feel a little useless once the party secures fast travel or if the group isn't role-playing the survival aspects of the game. However, if you are playing survival as per the given rules, this is a really strong feature. If your table doesn't value Natural Explorer all that heavily, Scout Rogue would be my recommendation. Survivalist is a free proficiency and expertise in nature and survival, on top of all of Rogue's remarkable class features. The surprise star here is going to be Barbarian. It seems to be where a lot of Barbarian's real roleplay meat was intended to come in. Since Athletics is the only strength-based skill, it's fairly possible to build a Navigator as a Barbarian that takes advantage of its Danger Sense feature to take the brunt of any traps or surprise attacks it sees coming from the front. With the possibility to gain proficiency with all the asked for skills when taken in tandem with certain backgrounds, the Barbarian can easily take on both the muscle and navigator dynamics for your group. While the Scout Roguish archetype exists, it's not the only means of creating a Scout character dynamic. A Scout is a sensory specialist adept at gathering information through reconnaissance, be it the location of certain objects, finding creatures, or hidden areas. This dynamic is critical in parties heavy on buff/debuffing supports, as these combat roles tend to get the most out of going early, and the Scout is the dynamic that helps to find the target to surprise. This dynamic has some overlap with the Navigator, Dungeoneer, and Sneak, but it prioritizes finding things to deal with as opposed to dealing with them directly. There are some really strong scouting tools and spells and class features, such as the Arcane Eye, Find Familiar, and Scrying spells, and Druid's Wild Shape, meaning it isn't strictly pinned down to dexterity-based characters. Languages are also a nice bump, but they aren't absolute necessities. Being able to translate what the kobolds in the next room are saying and figuring out where their ambushes and traps are, it's just a great way for you dungeon masters out there to make what tends to be a forgotten corner of the character sheet really pay off. I listed dexterity as being your primary and wisdom being your secondary, but these are pretty interchangeable. Really, you're going to be focusing on both perception and stealth pretty equally here. What sets a lot of scouts over the top is if their class gives them observational spells or features, and then if your character can get some additional languages, that's going to be really nice as well. My recommended class for this one is actually going to be Druid. While the Scout might feel like the perfect loadout for this dynamic, you cannot overstate how good Wild Shape is for scouting in absolutely every scenario. The different beasts mean that although Druid can't pick up stealth as a class proficiency, they can most certainly get it through a beast. Add to this that many of the beasts have traits that give them advantage on perception and stealth checks. Wild Shape is just the strongest scouting tool in the game. The Druid spell list includes spells like Beast Sense, Locate Creature, Locate Object, Scrying, and Speak with Animals. If you're playing with the variant rules in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, you can even get Find Familiar. Druid just provides everything this dynamic is asking for through a feature that continues to grow with you and provides so much flexibility. The surprise star here is going to be the Echo Knight Fighter. Once you reach 7th level in this subclass, the Echo you get is an infinitely refreshable, no-risk scouting tool that you can just swap places with. It's one of the core reasons I actually rate the Echo Knight so high on my ratings table and recommend that the Manifest Echo be tied to a limited number of uses. The Echo Knight might not cause issues during combat, and the range of 1,000 feet is definitely restrictive outside of dungeons, but wow, does it ever out-scout every other character as soon as you start delving. Now we have the Skulker in the Shadows, the character most likely to be taking the action leading to a surprise round, the Sneak. The Silent Assassin, the Scoundrel Pickpocket, and the Wicked Poisoner all rely on going unnoticed to achieve their goals, making them the sneaks we're used to seeing in fiction. This dynamic is firmly cemented in fantasy adventuring parties thanks largely to Bilbo Baggins. Thorin and Gandalf didn't pick him up thanks to his fighting prowess. They simply needed a burglar, and it turns out hobbits have a great knack for going unnoticed. Sneaks aren't tied down to combat mechanics though. Thanks to Rogue, this dynamic often blends with the Dungeoneer and Scout. Just make sure if you're blending this with the Scout that your party's aware that you're going from surprise coordination to confirmation. Proficiencies wise, you want stealth, you want expertise in stealth, you want advantage on stealth, you want straight up invisibility if it's available. If you can get dark vision, even better for creeping in the shadows, although this tends to be tied behind racial traits or spells. You're also going to value perception highly, because you can't really sneak if someone else can get the jump on you. Sleight of hand is also an amazing pickup for you pickpockets out there, and thieves' tools for breaking into and out of things. For your traits, your primary ability is going to be dexterity, pretty no duh there. Secondary is going to be wisdom to shore up your passive perception score. For these proficiencies, as I said earlier, perception, stealth, sleight of hand, and then thieves' tools are really nice, but they're not as crucial here to the sneak as they are to the Dungeoneer. Do I even really need to mention what the recommended class is? It's Rogue, duh. Surprise star here is going to be the Gloomstalker Ranger. This subclass, especially after Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, does everything magical you'd want from the sneak. It just lacks the mechanics to gain expertise or advantage in these checks. It's possible through feats to gain some of that kit, but Rogue getting so much of it just through the class itself keeps Gloomstalker just right under it. I'm sure most people think rightly so. Maybe if the 5e Rogue also got some help in darkness, this wouldn't be so close of a call. I actually really expected Way of Shadow Monk to wind up close to the top, but I always forget that the subclass has to blow 2 freaking key points just to get its dark vision. In any case, the Gloomstalker Ranger does get access to spells and skills that make it look like an extremely attractive sneak option. This one was actually a lot of work. I got started on the script for this back whenever I decided to do the Playstyles video series, and it was only here recently that I felt like really good about it, enough to get into filming and editing and all that stuff. So thank you all so much for all your support. If you're new to my channel, I cover a lot of D&D related content, music, sometimes talk about books, and I try to do live streams maybe once a week or every 2 weeks if I can. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, why not go ahead and subscribe? And I want to give a big shout out to my Patreon sponsors for helping me keep the lights on around here, coffee in my blood. You all are absolute heroes. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope you all are staying safe, staying healthy, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.